panic. The University of York is dropping its standards and lowering the entry requirements for international students. Some will be admitted with the equivalent of BBC grades at A-level, when most courses require AAA. This is apparently in response to the university having financial challenges. So, if you're an international student who isn't very academic, don't worry, York will have you. Joining me now is Professor of Politics Matt Goodwin. Now, Matt, with the government's new pledge to tighten university acceptance standards, is York going against it?
Well, it's not just York. I think lots of universities are going against it. Remember what Boris Johnson promised and Dominic Cummings in 2019, that Britain's universities were going to get the best of the best. We were going to bring the best global talent into our universities. They were going to go to Oxbridge and become scientists, and we were all going to benefit from this wonderful high-skill migration as a result. Well, fast forward 4 years, what we can see actually is the opposite of that. What's happening in higher education is we've basically seen the numbers of international students rocket. The numbers of their relatives have increased sharply as well.
So they bring dependents.
They bring dependents as well, but they mainly go to non-elite institutions outside of Oxford, Cambridge, and the more prestigious Russell Group.
Yeah.
The Migration Advisory Committee has shown that they tend to go to do 1-year MA programmes, 18-month MA programmes, and then, of course, you're in the country, you've got the right to work, you can stay, usually they stay for longer than the 2 years, they can take a job which has no skill requirement, no salary threshold, they don't need an official sponsor. So what Boris Johnson did really is sort of liberalise the student migration system, and the reason this really matters is because if you're a university going through financial problems and basically you're not functioning as a viable, successful business, what you can do now, what we see institutions like York doing, and many others, by the way, they can use international students and the higher fees that they're paying to basically plug the hole, to basically hide the financial crisis that's lurking underneath. And so rather than reform higher education and universities and make them more effective, make them work for Britain in a much more important, significant way, we've basically created a Ponzi scheme where we're bringing in typically low-wage, low-skill international students, typically from India, Nigeria. They're bringing in relatives as well, using public services schools and so forth, and they're propping up a lot of institutions, universities that would otherwise go bust. That's basically what's happening.
So is and you'll be an expert in this because, you've worked in the university system in academia for 20 years. You're at the University of Kent now, which is a great university. Is the university system almost being gamed to allow people to come in and just work and bring their dependents who can then work?
Yes, it's being gamed, and what we're seeing are not only students coming in typically to those non-elite universities, and then basically they're in the economy, they're in the country, and they've also got high dropout rates, by the way. There's some evidence showing that. But also, what worries me as well is that we are lowering our standards as a result. Now, I know a lot of academics myself. I'm not going to give names and institutions, but I know for a fact that people have been told not to fail international students because the institutions need their money.
Wow.
And I think actually with this York story, I noticed Lucy Fisher at the Financial Times broke it. I actually think this is the tip of the iceberg. I think this is the beginning of a national scandal, actually, about what's happening within higher education. We need to really take a step back and think, are we doing things as well and as effectively as we should be? Because we're not talking about lots of talented high-skilled students going to Oxbridge to become scientists, staying in the UK, paying taxes and so on. We're talking about a very different kind of migration, which I don't think, and I've written about this extensively on Substack and elsewhere, I don't think this is benefiting Britain over the longer term. So we just need to be real about what's happening. And
your Substack piece, which is excellent, by the way, you mentioned how it's going to impact immigration figures.
Well, I mean, it's already having an enormous impact. So both the numbers of international students has increased very sharply. The number of international students, dependents, their husbands, wives and children, has also increased very sharply. Now, the government has come out and said, James Cleverly has come out and said, well, those numbers are going to come down because what they're going to do is say to students and their dependents they can only come to Britain and work and bring relatives if they're on a research degree. Well, what you're going to see is lots of degrees over the next year are just going to be repackaged as research degrees so the universities can basically keep the system going. So look, the key point is this. We were promised a high-skill migration policy that would benefit universities, schools, the NHS, etc. What we got, and what this is an example of, is low-skill, low-wage, non-selective migration, which is propping up institutions that should otherwise go bust. This is bad for Britain. It's bad politics, bad decisions. Somebody in the government should stand up and say they got it wrong, and somebody should come up with a plan for making our universities what they should be and what they used to be, which is world-leading institutions.
Yeah, because this seems to be undermining just the idea of Britain as a place of academic excellence. I mean, can we trust British university degrees now if you know, standards are being cut so far? Well,
what worries me is if you look globally, the US is having a very vigorous debate about universities. Some of your viewers will have picked up on the head of Harvard, who just had to resign because she was discovered to have plagiarized much of her work, and there was that testimony at Congress about anti-Semitism and so on. In America, public confidence in universities has just fallen to the lowest level on record, according to Gallup, which is a really prestigious pollster. In the UK, more than half of people in the YouGov polling now say having a university degree is not worth what you're paying for it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of scepticism about higher education. This is really underlining my point. Unless the universities get their act together, unless the government gets its act together, my big worry is actually we're going to see public trust in universities, in higher education, fall off a cliff. It's not just about international students, it's about cancel culture. It's about people getting disinvited from university events. It's about students and speakers getting chased off campus. It's about all of these scandals that are rocking higher education. People are submitting, you know, funny academic papers to expose the lunacy of academic research. And the universities are silent on these issues, like the anti-Semitism issue recently. They wouldn't come out and condemn anti-Semitism unequivocally, and it was left to a few academics to come out and say, you know, we want to speak for British Jewish students on campus. You know, we want to express solidarity with them. The universities had no issue expressing solidarity with Black Lives Matter, which later came out in support of Hamas. So I think there is a deep double standard running through academic life. I'm a pariah for saying these things in public. I'll keep saying them because I think British students, the British taxpayer, deserves more than this.
Yeah. And are British students losing out as well? If the universities are encouraging overseas students because they get more money, does that mean fewer places for British students?
There's an argument that overall international students might be helping to prop up more universities, and therefore you might have more spaces for British students. But there's a trade-off, because what we're also doing is lowering standards. As the York story shows quite clearly. Are British students benefiting from that? I'm not so sure. And because of the record numbers of dependents that are coming with international students, to give you one example, it costs £5,000 a year for a child to go through primary school, £6,000 a year to go through secondary school. Is the British economy actually benefiting from this record level of student migration and student-dependent migration? Because I'm not actually convinced the economy is benefiting. It's not what Boris Johnson talked about. In 2019, he said we'd have world-leading scientists. We have some of those, but actually we have a much larger number of low-skilled students coming in from India and Nigeria, going to non-elite universities, and some of whom are dropping out before they finish their studies just because they can work in Britain and therefore they don't need to return at whatever skill level they want with no salary thresholds. I mean, we can do so much better than this.
And
that's the point.
I mean, in the final 30 seconds, can you see a solution? Or do some of these universities just have to go bust eventually?
Well, I think some of them will go bust eventually, simply because of the pressures on higher education. The solution is this. The solution is finding politicians who will stand up and say, we are no longer going to use mass migration to cover the crisis, not just in universities, but in our social care system, in our economy, in the NHS and beyond, because what we're doing is using migration to avoid having to make the really difficult decisions, and that needs to stop.
Well, Matt Goodwin, thanks so much for joining me.